let's see. Compare and contrast today. I don't know. Compare and contrast, I think, is not really it's not a simple concept, but because to compare and well,
Isn't as complex as many would think.
the thing is, it becomes complex. It becomes complex because good compare and contrast must combine the cause and effect step. Like, you can't compare two things without thinking about remote and immediate, not necessarily effects and causes, but qualities that these two things have. And you have to think about the cause and effects of everything associated with those two things. That's the problem. That's what makes compare and contrast so difficult to do it well, is that people often will feel like they know more about one thing than another, or they won't just do like the effective cause-effect analysis along with that, so that your compare and contrast as a process ends up being kind of rudimentary. It ends up being not really detailed and thoughtful as it should be. It's like a concept that's very simple to grasp. I'm comparing two things, but difficult to do so well. It's almost like, I feel like the opposite of, say, like chess. Like, chess is a very difficult game with a lot of complexities, and the people who do well at that learn those complexities, and then just by knowing the complexities, you win. This is more like, God, what is it like? Have you ever seen Smash Brothers? Anybody play Smash Brothers on like Nintendo? Yeah. Or Mario Kart even. Those are very simple games that you understand. Like, oh, I punch people. But the complexities you see when people like play those like online like competitions or something, and like you literally have people jumping off the edge and then hanging onto the wall so that somebody else can't come and hang on the wall to try to save themselves from dying. It's crazy. Like, there's all kinds of like complexities to those games. Like, but compare and contrast is kind of like that. It's something that seems simple on the surface, but the amount of complex thinking you have to do so well is what makes it hard. You compare two or more things that are the same. You contrast how two more things are different. I'm going to stop actually at that moment and do what we've been doing, because I think probably I'll prefer it that way, where I assign the assignment first, the Essay 3 assignment, then you have context for all the things that I end up saying. That sounds preferable, right? And I think that this is actually the simplest assignment I've had in terms of like what I ask you to do. It's very easy to just say what you have to do, but it's like the little tiny rules that go along with it, and then what you have to do to do a good job on this assignment. That's what makes it complex. So if I go over here to our class, 1301, assignments, the new assignment is there. I think this is updated as of last night. I think. Let me check and make sure. Okay. I was searching for a number I added last night. Whoa, let's calm down, buddy. Calm down. Big enough to see. So I would say that this essay, and I don't mean this to like, I don't know if this is a bad idea to say this, where like I say it and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But usually people like get a lower grade on this paper than they do on the research paper. And I've had some people who will end up writing all the papers in the class except this one because they don't want to do it. Because it's too open-ended. It allows them to think, like, to go and do like kind of too much thinking on their own, rather than the last ones where I've just kind of told you what to do. But basically what you do is you find two different news articles from established news sources, not like a blog or like a Facebook post or something. And it has to be written by named authors, people who have names, not usernames, but actual names. And both of these articles will be concerning themselves with the same news event. Ideally, they would both be written completely about the news event. They're reporting on the exact same situation, which doesn't necessarily have to be something as eventful as, say, like a shooting or an election day, or something that literally happens. I mean, sometimes it could be as simple as like a really important like article gets published in like a scholarly journal, and people read it and they go, oh, this actually has really big implications for how we approach something. And so then two different people end up writing articles, news articles about that study that came out. Granted, that rarely happens, but again, that would be an event. It's somebody published a journal article, and the two news articles are both publishing news on why they think that that is worthy of news. But there are some qualifications I have for these news events. What you do once you've got the two articles that are written about the same event is you write a compare and contrast essay where you're evaluating the similarities and differences between the two articles, specifically their portrayal of that event. So each one of them is going to choose different details to focus on. They'll choose to spend more time on this or that, not mention this one thing at all. Here's an example I could kind of talk to you about right now. You don't have, like in the media, like the news media, like the TV media, video media. I don't know if you've ever made this assumption on your own, but things like MSNBC, Fox News, what are the other ones? ABC News. And I'm not talking local stations, but what are the other big, like CNN? What are the big news networks? Yeah, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN. I know there's like one more at least. There's another liberal one. I can't remember which one it is.
Dallas Morning?
Oh, no, I'm talking specifically video news that you would see on cable. What was it?
Well, I already said that.
Oh, yeah, no, not local stations. But like the cable news is like national like broadcasted stations. But
Like well-known.
yeah, the big well-known, like big ones that have like all the ads and people talking, sitting around tables all the time while stock things roll on the screen. You know, those kind of news stations. Those particular ones are very ad-driven. They're big corporate machines. And as a result, they kind of need corporations to be protected. So no matter what candidates they're going to be showing on screen, for say president, like let's say Trump wins another presidency, and then 4 years after that, there's going to be a new Republican running and a new Democrat running. That's going to require lots and lots of news media from both sides trying to talk about like who's going to be the candidate. This time it's only really Democratic candidates, with the assumption being that Trump is going to be the incumbent. So incumbent meaning person that's currently in office, and that has to be overthrown in order to change. Currently there's an incumbent. But there's been something, for example, talking about the portrayals of news stories and like what details might not be included. A lot of people have like noted a what do you call it, a phenomenon right now where nobody in the news media hardly will mention Bernie Sanders. At least for a while they wouldn't. They wouldn't even mention him. Like there was literally, I think, a CNN poll or an MSNBC poll that asked who would you vote for president, and there were 5 candidates listed who were not Bernie Sanders, and they listed an other category, and the other category ended up being the most voted category because the biggest candidate was in that one. So specifically, they're trying not to portray that candidate because he's very outspokenly the only candidate who's not taking billionaire donors, and billionaire donors, if you had $1 billion, you probably have some big hand in a corporation. So the news media corporations, they're saying, don't put that guy on TV. He would be a disaster for us because he doesn't care. He can't be bought. The other ones can be bought. They've already been bought. He can't be. So he would be disastrous. Don't even say his name on air. We don't people even know he exists. The problem is he's becoming too big now. It's like not to report on him, they would be accused of essentially not telling the truth, I guess. Especially since he won the Iowa and what's the other one? New Hampshire primaries, I think. He won both of those. Narrowly, but he won them. After not even really being mentioned on the television. But that's the kinds of things I'm talking about here, is looking at what is mentioned in one news article. And I use TV example as an example because you can't write about video news sources. You're not allowed to do that. So me saying that doesn't take away something you're allowed to write about. But you're taking these two news articles, comparing how they're different, but not just talking about how they're different, but why are these articles different? What is it about each one of them, maybe the author of the newspaper, who they're writing for, that affects what they're saying and what they're not saying? For example, later in a couple class days, I'll show you that around the time of y'all can't use this event. I'm not taking anything from you because I've already got listed here as one you can't use. The Dark Knight shooting a couple of years ago. Everybody was worried that there was going to be a shooting at Joker because of what it was, but ended up, I think it was The Dark Knight Rises was the one that had a shooting many years ago. And there was a Denver paper that came out with an article that day, and there was a New York Times paper that came out with the article, and I show that the Denver article has a lot more details about individual experiences of people who were there. New York Times talks about it more in a broad way. And why do you think that might be? Why would a Denver article talk about a shooting that took place in Colorado with more details on the individuals than a New York Times article would? Where did I say the shooting took place?
Colorado.
Where was the newspaper I mentioned?
Denver.
Where is Denver?
Colorado.
You got it. Yeah. They figured more people are going to want to know more about the locals there. Like who was involved, is anybody I know? So they put a lot more detailed personal stories in that article because they feel it would be relevant to their local readership. So in that case, audience had a huge impact on why the choices were made in the article that were made. And that's kind of what you're going to be doing. You're going to be trying to figure out why the authors chose to write about their subjects in the way they chose to write about them. I'm getting everything wrong. And that, I think, the assignment itself where I say evaluate why two articles are written differently or similarly, that's a very easy thing to say. But you can see figuring out how and why they're different is very complex because every article will be different. You'll essentially be doing this for the first time. Nobody else has done this because you'll find the two articles. So it's all kind of like doing everything from scratch. And you have to find articles and then read them and figure out how they're different. So there's a complexity there. Your thesis is a very long thesis in this case. You may have to break it into multiple sentences. Because you need to be talking about both how they compare and why they compare. And in order to talk about how and why they compare, you have to first identify the two things, the two articles. Whenever you identify an article, you have to identify not just the author and when they wrote it, but ideally, if you're in the very first paragraph, you would also mention what paper it came from or news source. Because you don't have to use actual papers. You can do things like Huffington Post. That would be fine as well, which is one that only exists online, I think. You also have to mention the title of the article. So if you tried to force all that into one sentence, where it said, this article by this person written in this year, titled this from this newspaper, compares to this article written by this person and this person. And you're saying all those things, it becomes this long, complicated. In fact, I have a cheat sheet on the next page that has the thesis needs to contain, so it's got to be multiple sentences, the news event itself, both news articles, the name of each author, name of each article, name of each news source, how they compare and why they compare. Briefly. But that's a lot to include in one sentence, so don't feel forced into shoving it all in one place. And you do not simply list the qualities of each portrayal. You're not just saying how they're different. You also have to make it your goal, your purpose. That's what your thesis has to do is, in this case, explain why they're different. I think this is a very important skill to pick up around election times. You're going to see candidate, this candidate, that candidate. You're told they're from the same party. Doesn't that mean they're the same? I mean, that's what I've always heard. Democrats are Democrats. Liberals are liberals. Republicans are Republicans. Conservatives are conservatives. What's the difference? But you have to be able to take and do complex like compare and contrast analysis to figure out exactly how they're different and why that makes one better than the other. For example, like I think a typical Democrat, generally pretty anti-gun, would like to get rid of guns if they could, for the most part. Like as much as they could scale back gun ownership legally, they would. Whereas you have somebody who doesn't really fit that typical mold, where you have a candidate like Bernie Sanders, where he's really more of an independent, but runs as a Democrat this election, where he's kind of like, he says, well, the Second Amendment is the Second Amendment. We can't take away people's rights to defend themselves. Now I think he's okay with like reasonable limits, he says, of like having like, the felon stuff and automatic rifle attachments and things. I think he's, closing like the gun show loop where people don't have to say that they purchased a gun. You kind of have like these off the books guns because that's how people get killed. So there's even differences between parties. You need to be aware of that. I should mention as well, I don't know if they're actually going to do this. Usually government teachers give like extra credit for involving yourself in the voting process, but early voting starts tomorrow, guys, if you're 18. And it's not just the Democratic primary. There's more going on than that. There's local primaries. And a lot of people forget that the local elections are in many ways more important than the presidential election, because that person's kind of a figurehead for what direction the nation's going in its overall thoughts, while the people that you elect at the local level are the ones who actually have an effect on your area. And they advocate for you at the state level. So just something to keep in mind. And by the way, early voting on Tuesday, nobody's there. I don't know, Wednesday nobody's there. Tuesday they're all excited. But early voting, like whenever I've gone, it's just insane like how open it is. And everybody tries to go on election day when it's packed, which I don't understand. There's like 10 days of like, I think, early voting. And people all try to go on like the one day that's like the official election day, which I never really understood. So much more work. And I hate waiting in lines. I just hate it. Usually if there's a restaurant with a line, I leave. I go, nope, not going. Done. So with this, you'll of course have to find 2 news articles, which means you'll need a references page. You'll need in-text citation. The in-text citations ends up being kind of simple in this case because most newspapers don't list the page numbers one page at a time, so you don't have to cite page number. And because you're only doing 2 news articles, you're likely going to be mentioning the author's names back and forth. And if you're doing that, you probably won't ever have to have anything in parentheses besides the year, and it's usually just going to appear like right after the author name. I mean, you're probably not going to have to do a lot of difficult internal citation. So, I probably should tell you like the brief guidelines for the news event as well. That way, when I start talking about compare and contrast, you'll know whether the idea you're thinking of is even doable. So the guidelines for the news event, stuff you can choose and can't choose. I want the event to have some degree of controversy, whether that is politically, morally, etc. Like if somewhere there's a very controversial abortion law that's passed, and 2 news articles write about that abortion law that has been passed or is going to be considered, or has not considered, that's different, because if you're saying like considering abortion, that's not really a news event, that's a topic. For example, you can't find 2 people writing just about abortion as a subject. That's not an event. But if there was a law passed somewhere, or a woman got attacked outside of an abortion clinic, that's something that happened somewhere, and you can report on that. Even if there was an article published on abortion as a viable idea in society, that's an event. You can't just have articles that are written about topics, though, where somebody says, is abortion a good idea? And then like they just explore that the whole time without ever mentioning the same event that happened somewhere. Can't do that. So it's got to have some degree of controversy, and really I do that to make your job easier, because the more controversial it is, the more likely it's going to have differences that you can write about. No murders or killings that function as isolated incidents, like a husband murders a wife or something like that. There's usually those are sensational, but they're really not that controversial. Like in Commerce, like a couple weeks, like there was a shooting on campus where like I kept hearing people instead of saying the father were saying baby daddy, but essentially like the father of a child, and like or no, yeah, I think that was it. I think that it was a girl and her child were visiting that girl's sister at A&M Commerce, and the father of the baby found out where they were, and he went and shot the mother of his child, and I don't know if he shot the child intentionally, if that was like a ricochet or something, but then also shot her sister because she was just there, I guess. And then he tried to write something on Facebook that was like, I'm so torn up about this, which I think, and this as of right now, all I know is that he's a suspect, right? He's just a suspect. But apparently, there was evidence that led to him, and so they arrested him. So whether he ends up getting convicted in the court of law, that still is to be seen. But that in itself is not an event you could write about for this, because there's nothing controversial about it. It's not like somebody went to the school to do a school shooting, where that's controversial. It's like, what do we do about guns in America, that kind of thing. This is a domestic dispute. It's a guy was mad at somebody, so he shot him. And it's something almost everybody can agree that's wrong. It's one of those things where you're not going to see a lot of controversy there. It's just we find murders to be very sensational, and so we pay a lot of attention to them, even though really they're not that controversial. I think, honestly, whenever we like get really riveted to news stories about just basic murders like that we're kind of wasting our time. Like, I mean, you're not getting any smarter from it. You're not getting any wiser from it. You're just satisfying your mind's lust for blood. Really. I mean, if I had to be honest about my personal opinions about closely following like murder situations. And the stats that, like, there's a lot of murders in your area, maybe you get concerned. But like, I'm not, just because they happen in my town, I'm not like, oh my gosh, I might get shot. Like, how? Like, it was a mile and a half from me. It was in the college with 2 dorm students. I mean, honestly, it has like almost no relevance to me. My wife was at the college, and I like texted her. I said, "You okay?" She's like, "Yeah, apparently there's some student in the dorm." I was like, "No actual shooting, active shooting or anything?" No. I was like, "Okay." Because you have to think statistically, is this actually even likely to be harmed? But it's just something about death. We get freaked out. People don't fly on planes. They think they're going to crash. But statistically, that's way less likely than you getting behind the wheel today and getting in a wreck. So I'm trying to take you away from like the sensational, get you to the controversial. Oh, please, for the love of everything, no serial killers, no conspiracy theories.
So no Ted Bundy?
No. No paranormal events. I think I actually added a word to somewhere. No supernatural. It appears on a later sheet or somewhere, but supernatural I would also consider to be like paranormal, something that's outside the norm of physical possibility. Yes.
But like, don't those like grab our readers' attention enough?
In like the most basic of ways, like not in like an intelligent way. It's like lots of people got murdered. Ooh, like if you ask like 100 people, was this person wrong to serial kill these people? They would be like, yes. So everybody's not reading because of an intellectual disagreement they have with the concept, which I think is what makes controversy interesting. Those people are just going, wow, people got murdered all by the same dude, and he didn't get caught. What's going on? I do not like those being written about, because another thing that ends up happening is oftentimes the person I have writing the essay gets really into the topic, and it ends up blinding them to the topic, as I expect to see when I read some of your superhero film papers. You're gonna be like, Thor is amazing, he's so pretty, and I'm like, no, that's not. Thor himself is not the reason why everybody watches all the Marvel films. Thor was not the reason for Guardians of the Galaxy success. No conspiracy. So like, what was that? Casey Anthony, who like was acquitted, I guess, or like got off of.
JFK isn't dead.
Huh?
Or why JFK was shot.
Or yeah, like Jimmy Hoff, any of that kind of stuff. Like,
Is it still alive?
because in those cases, the controversy is not actually about the rightness of what happened or what could happen, but the mystery of just what happened. And so once people find out the answer to that controversy, they may not even disagree morally about what happened. Like if we just found out that JFK was killed by an ex-lover who was really good with a sniper rifle, we'd be like, oh, okay. You know, like if that was like the whole reasoning, like, but so really it's the mystery itself of what happened that is driving us. It's not actually controversial in and of itself, or may not be. And paranormal events as well, like somebody thought they saw the Virgin Mary on like a tree, like that's not news. It's just not news. I baked a cookie and it looks like Jesus' face. It doesn't look like it looks like white Jesus' face that you see painted everywhere. There was no white Jesus. The people that get patted down at airports, Jesus probably looked mostly like them. You know, like that. You know, the person that like maybe some of your parents or family members will say they need to stop letting them terrorists in this country. That's what Jesus looked like. Just so you know, he was from that area of the world. Was not painted like your painting show. No events older than 30 years. This is not because I have a problem with that. Mostly it's just because it's difficult to find database articles that far back. There are very few options. So 1990 is about as old as you can go. And there will be a lot of sources called wire sources. You'll see, if you get to look really close, no AP wire, no CNN wire, no things that aren't news sources like encyclopedias or even articles that are put out by news organizations that are kind of summaries. They're like their own little mini Wikipedias called fact sheets. Because there's some of those on like 9/11 out there. There's like 9/11 fact sheet. And it just gives you like a timeline of everything that happened. But that's a result of all of the articles they wrote over time, and now they're just condensing it into a list. That's not truly an article. I want articles that are responses to events written about those events, not lists of facts. It's not quite the same. An AP wire, that's really like they you can subscribe to the AP wire. Have you ever like gotten a Dallas paper or something, or like let's say you got a Commerce Journal paper?
Like a newspaper?
Yeah, like Greenville Herald Banner paper. And you read it because there's like some crazy story in there, like a shooting, and you're like, oh my gosh, I want to read that story. And you're like, I wonder if it's in the Dallas News. You go to the Dallas News, you pick both of them up, you bring them home, and you read the stories, and you read the Greenville Herald Banner first. You're like, it's crazy, it's crazy. And you go and you read the Dallas Morning News, you're just like, oh man, that's crazy too. Actually, it's very similar, I think, to what I already read. In fact, that's very similar to what I already read. And you look and you realize it's literally the same article. But Dallas Morning News asked Greenville Herald Banner for permission to print it, like reprint it in their paper. In the case of the AP Wire and CNN Wire, news organizations subscribe to wire information sources. So like there's a company that like literally they just will put out tons and tons of like quick factoids about news events as they happen. And then that goes to an article writer who's in a newsroom somewhere who's not actually at that place. And they use what the Associated Press came up with and various information they find from other sources to help write their article. So it's kind of like they're using that as like their info, like their pre-writing stuff, and they just build from that. So if you see it's written by the AP Wire, CNN Wire, it's usually going to be very short and not super useful to you because you're going to see any opinion there. It's going to be pure fact. Let me see. You probably care about this. It's probably the only thing you've wanted to see the whole time. 750 words. A little longer than the last one, I think. Not much. This one has to be third person, just like the last one did. Must have a references page. Must have 2 news sources cited in APA style. You can use the databases. You're not required to. Just know that you'll have to build the citation. And I think I showed you how you can copy paste them on the databases. If you found them just on the web, you would have to build those yourself. And it's not as simple as it may seem that way, but it's not. If y'all did this in high school where your teacher was like, well, there's just this easy website where you can bib.me and you can like paste the web address in there and it'll make the citation for you. That is true. It will, but it's rife with inaccuracy. And you often have to double check it, triple check it because it's way off. You have to check even the ones that are in the databases, but you have to check the ones that you just paste a link in for it even more. It's sometimes just easier to just follow the simple rules in the APA style manual. Say like, do I have an author? Yes, I do. Write it like this. And just do that over and over again. There's only 2 you have to do, so it's not too bad. I had already said this earlier, but do not use any news channel sites such as CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, etc. No TV news is allowed whatsoever. I think there's also like, there's an online news source called The Hill. Have y'all heard of that? There's Politico. And I think that those are fine. However, I think they also have their own YouTube channels where they have panelists who sit around and talk about things. Those you can't use. Nor can you use transcripts of video sources. So you got to be very careful sometimes when you find an article. Sometimes it'll have a name and then a colon, and then a name and then a colon. That means that that's actually an interview that took place. It's not a real news article. So you can't use that. Often it's just a written down version of a video news source. And also, the news articles, I require them all to be at least 400 words a piece, which is roughly the length of, at least the length of your, what, first paper you wrote? How long was that paper? 500 words, 600 words? I can't remember. I've just noticed that anything less than 400 words and the students are, it seems easier, right? You're like, well, if I find shorter articles, my job's going to be a lot easier. It's actually the opposite. If you have a couple of 1,200 word articles, that's a nice length where you get a pretty succinct, easy to read news story. Each one takes you about 3 to 5 minutes to read. You get enough detail to compare and contrast, but not feel like you need to spend 8 pages doing it. It's a pretty decent length, 1,200 words per article. And then your paper only ends up being 750, and it's easy to manage that. But when you have 2 400-word articles, you feel like you're kind of done after about 500 words. There's not much else to write. And so it's counterintuitive, but the longer articles make your essay easier to write, just so you know. And events that are off limits, you can't write about any presidential debates, including primaries. So any of the debates you've seen right now, if they're writing like a news article about, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren's or Joe Biden's debate performance, you can't talk about that because the sample paper is on that, and I've noticed that people just tend to copy the sample paper and change out names of people out of temptation. I just want to have you I'm not going to allow you that temptation. You also can't write about the Dark Knight shootings. Don't choose events earlier from 1989. I think I said 1990, but just go by the 30 years. I guess it depends on when you start the calendar year. Let's see. I think I already covered all this stuff. I got my cheat sheet here. The news articles must be written by identifiable and different named authors, not anonymous usernames. Must have identifiable titles for their articles. I already said it has to be a legitimate news source, but that doesn't include not simple hosting sites like WordPress. I'll have a lot of people use WordPress, which is just blog websites. They must publish articles daily, weekly, or monthly in some fashion. So like they're coming out with articles on a regular basis, not just somebody that publishes one article and says they're a news source. That's really a blog. Must not be written video news. Must be legitimate news. 400 words. And we'll get to the stuff below in a minute because that's more relevant after we've talked about the compare and contrast. But this is just the guidelines for how to choose. So want something controversial, it's actually an event, but not one of the kinds that I mentioned. Now, compare and contrast. Doing good compare and contrast is a lot like when we talk about classification division, putting things into categories, breaking them down into smaller categories. regarding various subjects and events and qualities that they have. So like think about now during an election time. The only way to make sense of these events, these candidates sometimes, is to compare and contrast the viewpoints and data we see. You know, what are their views? Contrast their views. Whose views do I like more? And then you decide on a candidate. The very act of evaluating uses both compare and contrast as well as classification division. I don't mention this, but it also uses cause and effect in order to do it well. Specifically, the ideas of immediate and remote things that we may or may not see on the surface. It's important that you first make sure you have a basis for comparison. It's one of the reasons I have the two articles have to be written about the same news event, because it's more likely you'll be able to find a definitive reason for why they're different that is actually interesting if you have a basis for comparison, and have that basis for comparison be that they're both about the same event. In the past, I had somebody, they were writing about two different events, each one of them being a shooting, and they said, why were they different? Like the question, the way they answered that was, well, one is about this shooting, and this other article was about this other shooting, and that caused most of the differences. And I was like, you don't say. So one of the reasons I have that same news event is because otherwise the paper would be far too easy. You just say, well, they're written about different stuff. That's why they're different. And I would be like, well, duh. Bless you. Was kind of what I said to the students. I was like, bless your heart. Of course they're different. So think about basis for comparison. Like, you can't compare the cuteness of a puppy to the length of a pipe. You know, like, well, I mean, do I buy this puppy? It's really cute, but I don't know, the pipe's pretty long, so, you know, there's not really a way to compare those two things. You're saying them next to each other, but it doesn't make them compare. You can compare things in analogy, which is not something we're doing in our essay, but that's a way to compare two things that are completely different, but maybe share similar functions. So if I say that the act of writing is very similar to the act of playing basketball, some of you might be like, oh, I get it, or no, it's not, or but basketball's fun. But if you think about it this other way, where you break it down into its component parts, the qualities, like I told you, then in basketball you learn fundamentals, exhaust yourself through drills, you practice shooting and working as a team, not just on your own. Then have practice games, finally move on to some real games after a certain point. Once you've played the real game, then if you've got a really good coach or really good resources as the school that you're at, you will watch a recording of your performance, see what you did, the kind of decisions you made, determine where you can improve, and then you play another game, and so it goes. And this is similar to writing in that you learn terminology and process, which is kind of like learning the fundamentals. Then you'll pre-write in preparation, practice writing the papers or drafts. That's kind of like practice shooting and working as a team, and you having practice games. You'll determine it's good enough to turn in, so you'll actually play a real game. Then you receive a paperback graded, so that's like once you've viewed your performance. You find your mistakes, you revise, you turn it again. So you take what you learned from the video of your performance, modify your play style, play the next game. You write the next paper, remember what you learned from your previous experience, and so it goes. And that sports metaphor can apply to lots of things. Usually, I end up getting pretty good at lots of things pretty quickly. Sometimes people are, it sounds like I've got an ego. Not about everything. Am I saying that I have this ability? But if it's anything that can be researched, usually I'm pretty good at picking up something. Like, I remember my ex-wife's brother introduced me to Halo 2, and he'd been playing for months online. And then I went and we bought an Xbox. I think we bought two because she wanted to play two. She always made really smart financial decisions. She's like, well, I want you to play and me to play, and us play as a team so we can beat people. It's like, we can't afford two Xboxes. We're buying them. I should have found another TV too. But what I did was, instead of just play like she did and her brother did, I would play. Then I would go and I'd watch videos of people playing online, watch what they did, read about what people's strategies were in the competitions, watch pro competitions, see what people did in those games. One of the most effective strategies is if you think somebody could be running out around a corner in a second, throw a grenade down the hall. They don't cost much. You usually die before you're able to throw your grenades off anyway. Might as well just chunk them. It's one of those things. Get good at jumping. Learn your character's jumps. Never be satisfied with an inaccurate but fast shooting gun. Get good at shooting accurately. Learn the tricks for moving the cursor across the head. Figure out the hitbox. All kinds of stuff. You just research all this stuff. And I got better than him in 6 months. He was very pissed off. He was like, let's play a one-on-one. What do you got? And I'm like, you don't want to mess with me. And I beat him. But you can get good at anything as long as you research. That usually gives you a leg up. So if you're willing to look at something, look at its qualities, break it down, classify, divide, look at remote and immediate effects, look at the things that are effective, the things that aren't effective, you can get good at anything. It's all about how curious you are and how much you are willing to put in the work. A lot of people see me like do things for the first time or like early on, and they'll be like, wow, you were so good. Like, you were just good at everything. I'm like, I'm not. You told me we were playing this game. I went on YouTube. I looked at like some strategies that people were supposed to have basically, and then I came here with that knowledge. Like, if you don't want me to beat you, don't tell me what game we're playing ahead of time. Because I can't resist. I'm like, I got to figure out this game. I got to know what this is. You know? We show up in it, do something else. Don't mess with the researcher. That sounds like the least scary statement ever. Ooh. And when you compare and contrast, you have to do so equally. You have to recognize when you're comparing in equal ways and when you're not. You have to be clear about those comparisons as well. So when you're comparing an essay, you have to compare the same qualities. So imagine you're choosing somebody to date, right? You're like, I got to date I got 2 people to choose from here that I want to date. Do I go with person A? Because he looks really good. Like, he's super attractive. He has an awful personality. Really bad. Like, he's made me cry twice. I've known him for a week. Health-wise, though, he is fit. He looks good. He is muscular. And he's not hard to look at. If you're doing the same thing with person B, you also need to compare the same stuff. You need to say, well, he looks great. He looks okay. He looks okay. He looks okay. I mean, he's not somebody you'd want to show off immediately. This person's personality is terrible. This person's personality, though, very nice. Makes me feel good. Makes me laugh. This person's health, really muscular, attractive. Just want to touch him. This person's health, he's got some health to work on. I mean, maybe could go to the gym on occasion. Doesn't at all. And see, those are even comparisons because I'm comparing looks to looks, personality to personality, health to health. What I can't do is have the reader make assumptions about what the comparison might be by not making sure to always compare the same qualities and fully compare them. So, like, I can't say, well, person A looks really good, but person B has a great education. Because I'm not actually comparing looks to looks here. I'm comparing looks to education, which don't compare. This person's very educated. This person looks great. Personality is terrible. He doesn't have much money. His health is great, but his values are great. I need to compare them equally by saying, he looks great, other guy not so much. He's got a terrible personality, made me cry. Other guy makes me laugh, be happy. This guy's super healthy. This guy could be more healthy. This guy has a great education, now, person A has a terrible education. I don't even think he's been to school since high school. I think he dropped out because his daddy's rich. This person has a great education, cares about learning. This person A, lots of money, rich parents. This person over here doesn't care about money so much. This person over here has terrible values. Awful. I think he's already cheated on me. Person B, though, great set of values. Wants kids. Loves all the things that I think are important in life. And so ultimately you come down and after doing all those equal comparisons between the different qualities, you make the wrong decision and choose person A. And then when they dump you, you hope that person B is still available. No, I'm sorry, they don't really dump you. They cheat on you and keep dating you and don't tell you. That's what they do. By the way, don't do that. Always pick person B. My wife did. It's me. I'm person B. I really don't care about money. Like, not even a little bit. None. Thesis. In a comparison contrast, the thesis must do a couple of very specific things. Not only should the subjects that are going to be compared be identified, person A and person B, but also the point that you will make about them. So you not just have to compare them, but have a purpose for that comparison. If I go look up an Xbox and a PlayStation online, look at their qualities, like their specifications, what's my goal in doing that? If I was to write an article for a reader about the differences between an Xbox and a PlayStation, what would the goal be with that? Presumably, what would somebody read that article to decide?
Which console is better?
Which console is better? Why would they want to know which one's better? So they just read it and they go, oh, okay. And then they close the article and never think about Xboxes and PlayStations ever again? And they would go back to reading books? What would they do? If they went out looking for that article, what's their plan on what they're going to do after that? Yes?
They want to see which one to buy.
Yeah. So you're essentially going to give them the guidance to say, this one should be purchased between these two for this reason. So the point you're going to make is one of these is better for purchase. Of course, these days they almost aren't. Really, it's just kind of like what do you like with Xbox and PlayStations? I mean, it's the usage of them themselves because they almost have the exact same specs. They're like very, very similar on their specs. It's kind of just like which controller do you like holding more? Which online service is easier for you to use, has the most to offer there. Now you have to do both of those things, identify and make a point about them, or it's not a thesis. If you just identify them, that's an Xbox, that's a PlayStation. I mean, that does nothing. There's no point in saying that. You'd say this is an Xbox, this is a PlayStation, and this Xbox is better than this PlayStation because of this reason. So you have to have a thesis. Now, a structure on compare and contrast essays, one of which we will not do, is number one, subject by subject. That would be if I said, here's all the qualities of person A and cover all of them all at once. Then I would say, here's all the qualities of person B and cover those all at once. But if I go show you one of those Xbox, PlayStation comparison sheets, they almost always put them side by side, with the goal being you can do a point-by-point comparison, which is the second type, where you're comparing each point to each other. That way you're not having to remember vast quantities of information. And I'll just show you. I think this is the window. So if I go to like Xbox versus PlayStation 4 versus Xbox One, is that the Onion? Oh gosh, I'm not going to look at that one. By the way, don't use the Onion as your news source. It is a fake news source. Just in case no high school teacher ever covered that. So let's see, we have PS4 versus Xbox One, which gaming console is better? We'll see if this is one that I want to look at. It looks like they are doing a point-by-point comparison like I'm talking about. They do price first. So they're showing us the price of a PlayStation versus the price of an Xbox. Then later they're telling us about the hardware and design. So it's talking about like the features of design and what that does. So that's the next category. Connectivity, getting online, what's it like? So it's going through each one of the specs, and you can even do a specs comparison where you literally just have them side by side, I think. Oh, it's not doing that in this case. The simplest way is to have them side by side, but they're talking to them like a paragraph at a time. I hate the internet. My website is going so slow. because of the daggum ads that continue to play and perfect 4K video in the background. Stupid internet. Back in my day, we didn't have ads. That's not true. We didn't have the internet. That actually is true. When I was younger, there was no internet. I mean, they had it, but nobody used it. It wasn't like a thing. It was all green screen computers, like on Fallout. If you do a subject-by-subject comparison, the reason that doesn't really work great in an essay is you're asking somebody to remember everything about one subject and then everything about another. It only works for really short subjects. Oftentimes, it's maybe when I approach a joke or something where two things could be compared in similar ways. Point by point, though, is just the way to go because you can kind of check off like what category does this win that category? Does this win that category? If you're doing a comparison of things to prefer. So I might just say, okay, well, this guy wins the looks category, the health category, and the money category. The other guy wins these other categories. And so I'm keeping like a list of which one wins which, so I'm keeping them separate versus having to remember everything about one and everything about the other. I'm not going to do that yet. Nope. I did do the end of the library presentation, I think, didn't I? I may have to the end of that thing. Opposing viewpoints database. Yeah, I can show you that in a minute. Academic Search Complete database. I think I've shown you that one too. I do want to look a little bit maybe at the sample and get down to 3 and 4 here. So the how they compare stuff. So your essay, remember, you don't just pick an article and then you're going to compare them, but you have to talk about like how they compare. So here are the things you can consider. Differences or similarities between the manner in which each author portrays, so like they present it or they display it, they communicate it, whatever, the news event, such as like what details they include or not include. And you're only supposed to be using 2 articles, you're not supposed to be using more. So I don't want people going out and finding a 3rd article to then give reference for the other 2. I just want you to reference them by each other. So say, well, this one includes a detail, this one does not. Don't say this other 3rd article confirms whether that's a true detail. I don't want y'all going into that much detail on this. If there are certain individuals mentioned or not mentioned, kind of like I mentioned with the news sources, not mentioning Bernie Sanders because of the economic motivations they have, because he's not very fond of money or corporations. The opinions they might give about the event. That's why the controversy is so important, because they're going to usually vary pretty wildly on their opinions. Perspectives included on the event, like they might decide to include a certain group's perspective, like people who were there, or not include at all. The tone of the article, sometimes the tone will be very serious, sometimes very joking. Sometimes it's very angry, sometimes it's very complacent, indifferent, sad. There's all kinds of different ways that the author might seem when writing. And those are ways that you can compare them. And each essay must show, and this is one of the #1 things students don't do in this essay. #1 things. Anytime you say the article is like this, like you say the article includes various perspectives from different people. You should be quoting the article to show that it actually does these things you say it does. The article has an angry tone. Like if you say the article sounds angry, you better find me a quote that sounds angry. Because just to tell me it's angry, I mean, it doesn't really do anything. I need to see a quote. Then after you've cataloged those differences, and remember, it's like I've told you before, anytime you start writing, you should already know your purpose before you even begin. You got to know where you're headed. You need to be aware why these 2 articles are different before you ever put your pen to the page or your fingers to the keys. I don't know, how do you say it? Used to be an easy metaphor, now it's difficult. So you will need to, before you ever start writing, evaluate the differences, identify them, maybe put them in a list, then figure out, well, why would these differences exist? And how do you figure out the why? How do you locate the reasons why two articles might be different? Well, some of the stuff that I showed you in the library presentation is the stuff that's going to be the easiest. Think about the immediate and the remote. A lot of times students will just think about, well, he just chose to do it that way. But that's kind of like the immediate thing. That's just like, or maybe like, oh, he's just, I don't know, maybe he was in a good mood or something. Like, don't go with the iffies and the maybes. Go with the evidence you can find. So consider things like the authorship. Who's the author? What do you know about them? What can you look up? What's their background? What else have they written? Who do they work for? How long have they been writing? How old are they? Where did they graduate from school? You should be able to find all this stuff online through searching for the article writer, if they're a well-known enough article writer. And I'm telling you right now, I'm warning you that I said they have to have 2 articles that have authors, and the authors are named. So don't find me one article that has no author on it, because I have a lot of students will do that. They'll say this article, and they're like, oh, well, there's no author. But that automatically takes away, 1, credibility, and 2, any chances you have of being able to figure out what that author's motivations are, because we don't know who did it. And we have to be able to find somebody's motivations in order to know whether to trust them. For example, there was an article we found one time that written by somebody saying that all student loan debt should be forgiven. All of it. Very important that we do so, and comparing it to the bailout for the banks, which I do think is kind of compelling a reason, because I think that the bank bailout, where we bailed out the banks so the stock market would recover that one time, because they were very irresponsible with housing mortgages. Basically, they were like, our bad, can you save us? And like the American taxpayers bailed them out. But that amount, I think, was higher than all student loan debt in the country at the time. Like, it may have actually been more of an economic boost to just forgive all student loan debt than it would have been to give the banks tons of money, because they weren't responsible with it the first time. It's kind of strange, isn't it? Like, if you had somebody that worked for you and you gave them 10 grand and they lost it, they're like, oh, our bad. And you're like, I'm really mad at you. You shouldn't have done what you did. Here's $10,000 more dollars. Like, it's very nonsensical. It seems like you would like hire somebody else or give somebody else the 10,000 because they weren't responsible with the first time. But it is what it is. When we read the article, though, we looked at the author, looked him up, found his credentials. The dude graduated from a law school, so he was a lawyer for a time, but he didn't seem to work for a practice. So I was wondering, did he have trouble finding a good law job? Says he worked as a public defender for a while, but those don't make as much as like the lawyers that get paid in the private practices. So I looked up where he went to school, and we were able to deduce that if he went there and did not pay out of pocket, which is very unlikely anybody pays out of pocket for college, that dude probably had around $250,000 in student loan debt from law school. $250,000. So this guy had a vested personal interest in making sure student loan debt was forgiven, because if he did, there goes $250,000 that he owes. Oh my word! What was it? I saw this today. Like, you don't know how like bad student loans can be, because it's so easy to take them out. Just a warning. So if you've taken out some student loans right now, okay, but like try not to take out too many, because what was this person who put a tweet out or something I saw last night? Like, it's kind of insane. Come on, tweet. Where are you? This is incredibly relevant to you and your education. Because you're being educated right now, right? So this person said, I graduated my undergraduate degree with $38,200 in loans. To date, I've paid $20,763 on those loans. $20,000, right? So minus $38,000 is what? $38,000 minus $20,000 is what? 18. So that's how much you would think around you would have left, right? She said, my balance is $37,615 is what I have left to owe. So she's paid off technically $600 so far. Because what they ask you to pay is a huge amount of money per month, and it's just the interest. You're making like a $400 a month payment, $500 a month payment, but it's all going toward the interest basically. There's very little that's going toward the principal, which means your actual, basically they just get to kind of have this nice big chunk of money that keeps generating interest, so they keep charging you the interest every year, and you keep paying the interest, so you pay nothing off. So this guy with a $250,000 loan debt, he's probably got a $2,000 to $2,500 a month payment, and none of it's going toward that $250,000. It just sits there, getting bigger if he misses a payment. I think you can actually, they can garnish your taxes and your wages from it if you don't pay college loans. It's very risky.
You can't file for bankruptcy either.
Yeah, not to get rid of student loan debt. Although it is, I believe, now the second highest form of loan debt in the country besides credit card, or it's even surpassed it. I can't remember which one. So if I find out that an author has taken out $250,000 in loans, or could have, because it's very unlikely he would have paid that out of pocket, that could have a huge effect on his views on forgiving student loan debt. He's now biased. So that's one reason that article might be written differently. You can also go to the funding, also sometimes called the sponsorship. Who's the sponsor of this article? And if I find out that the person or group that sponsored the article, the newspaper itself, is owned by a certain media corporation, I looked up that media corporation, and I found out that that media corporation has a heavy hand in, say, like Spectrum Cable, but the article itself was about, like, news about an FCC decision that would negatively affect cable companies, and the article has a negative position on that new FCC law, well, then it looks like it's been affected by the sponsor. The sponsor themselves are the reason. Sometimes, too, the sponsor is wound up along with the audience in the location. So the location of where something is printed might make a difference. You might have a Texas article that's writing about the Dark Knight shooting, and it sounds a lot less dire in terms of how we need to get rid of guns than, say, a New York Times article or a LA Times article that are written in liberal states. Weirdly enough, later I show you sample, I think, articles where the opposite happens. You have a guy saying, well, really, guns aren't the problem. It's our inadequate measures for helping people not get in these situations in the first place where they develop these violent tendencies. And that guy was from the New York Times. The Austin American-Statesman, however, was very much just get rid of guns, make them go away. We got to have some reasonable limits here. We're not talking seriously about getting rid of guns. And that was a Texas paper. But when I really analyzed it further, looked a little more remote, figured out that the New York Times has a large national readership and is probably always under the microscope for whether or not it has a liberal bias. So they have to seem more even-handed all the time. Whereas the Austin American-Statesman is a liberal paper centered in Republican seat of like all the, it's a liberal town, that's the one big liberal town in Texas that's super liberal, even like everybody that lives there basically. But Congress itself, the state capital, is composed mostly of Republican congressmen. So they're hoping, I think, that maybe the congressmen who are there will read the articles that they put out and will get afraid and think, oh, this is the public's view, because they just, go out for a coffee or something, they grab a newspaper, and that's what they see. So that the location can affect, depending, sometimes opposite of what you think, why the article is written in that way. And then you'll have the audience themselves. Who does it seem like is being written for? That can affect not just where they are, but the demographic they're shooting for. Now, this is news media. This isn't really, this is like the media, like cable company type news, not so much the print news. But I noticed in the last election, and sometimes I think even in this election, that Fox News will put Bernie Sanders on. And I've wondered about that. It's been very curious to me. And I've been trying to figure out. I'm like, he's very like anti-establishment. He's, you know, you all remember Trump would say he wants to drain the swamp in Washington. You remember that? Bernie Sanders essentially does the same thing. He just doesn't say drain the swamp. He thinks that there's too much establishment politics. There's too much big money in politics. There's too much corporate strongholds that make sure everything happens the way they want to, and no laws get passed because of what the people actually want. So he's very anti-corporate. But I honestly think that Fox News was willing to put him on because they thought he was such a long shot for becoming a presidential nominee that they're trying to drive their own user base, conservatives, into furthering their conservative opinions by putting a person on there who, while he's not technically a socialist, he's a democratic socialist, which is way different. It's like the difference between sodium and sodium chloride, you know, two chemicals that act way differently. But I think they thought it would rile their base up and make their opinions even stronger than they were before about their own personal beliefs. So if you put somebody on there, you know, if you throw an enemy on your screen, everybody kind of goes, you know, gets angrier. It's a way to rile up your base. However, I think at the time, if you look at, you know, the stuff that was happening with, you know, the Ukraine and the withholding of aid and because of Biden, I think that honestly the Republican establishment was far more worried at the time about the establishment candidates from the Democratic Party, people like Biden, who they just assumed was going to get the nomination, and now he's polling at 4%. Crap really has hit the fan for people like, you know, Biden and establishment politics, and everybody's kind of shocked by what's happening right now, I think. So the audience that they were trying to reach on Fox News, I think they realized who their audience were. They were conservatives. And they wanted to further make them conservatives because that makes their job as a news media corporation easier. The further our viewers believe what we want them to believe, the easier it is to report to them because you don't have to have as many informational, you don't have to be as detailed in your information because if somebody's already on your side, the further they are on your side, the more loyal they are to you, the less you have to worry about actually being right. Because they'll just continue to eat up whatever you say. And the same problem happens in the liberal news media as well. I think, back in the election in 2016, I think a lot of people were shocked that Trump became the nominee. However, even the liberal media was putting him all over the screen because people knew who Trump was. They remember him from The Apprentice. They're like, oh, he's a famous guy. Let's look at views. And so they put him on there, thinking he was such a long shot to become president. They would get a lot of views out of it, and then like he would never be the president. And then he was. So the same thing happened with people like MSNBC, where they viewed their audience and thought they knew what was going to happen by publishing in this way, but they ended up not being able to anticipate. Now, whether they're able to anticipate is irrelevant to you. You're just looking at why are they doing it. For example, my daughter might think that if she screams to high heaven, I might give her what she wants. All it does is make me angry. And then I put her in timeout. It didn't go her way. Doesn't change that why she screamed in the first place was so she could get what she wanted. That's the basics of the paper and motivations and how to look at motivations to get you started. I will warn you that a lot of students have told me they spent 2 to 3 times as much time looking for their articles and deciding on an event/topic than they did actually writing the paper. So may want to get started on that sooner rather than later. Have a good one.